Ladies and gentlemen, it is our pleasure to call to the stage Ambassador Dennis Ross and Ambassador Ron Prosor, moderated by Israeli news anchor Tali Moreno.
Erev Tov, Shalom. Going up on stage after Mr. and Mrs. Edelson is like going up on stage after Beyonce. I mean, you know you're after the peak, but we'll do our best. So, gentlemen, we would like to use your knowledge, your experience to try to understand where Israel is going, where she should be going, And I would like to start with your permission with the UN, the United Nations. And nowadays, some see the UN as a non-effective organization. The President of the United States is one example. And I wonder if that is so, then why keep fighting within it? Why keep holding on to it?
You served there.
Well, Tali, first of all, you're talking about the nations which are not united against anything, but maybe against Israel. But the idea is that Israel needs a voice. Israel has to be present because vacuum fills. So yes, this organization has many problems, and some seem funny, but the minute you really dive in and you see the problem structurally with this organization, you understand that Israel has to have a voice there. Now, what am I talking about? I'm talking about 193 member states, out of which only 87 are democracies. I'm talking about different agencies, organizations like the Council on Human Rights that are chaired by amazing Jeffersonian democracies like Syria and Libya. It's like having Charles Manson run the crime investigation squad of the NYPD. You have a structural bias against Israel, which demonizes and delegitimizes Israel. And that is why each and every person around this room is in a battlefield which is maybe the biggest challenge that the state of Israel had for many years. They tried to get at us, you know, through military means and wars. They tried the economic boycotts, and now they're going for a soft belly, hence trying to put a wedge between Israel and the Jewish communities abroad. And this is a huge fight, and it's the fight on the values that we all cherish, our identity, things that really make us who we are. And that is why we need to be there, and we need to really speak out the truth about what Israel is all about.
Do you agree?
Look, the UN is not going to go away, and Israel should never deny itself a voice. It has an effective voice.
Has an effective voice.
It has an effective voice because when there is an international platform, and Ron knows this as well as anybody, even those who may not be in a position to acknowledge it publicly, they do recognize it and understand it privately. And the potential for change exists. It'll take a major effort, as Ron says. You have to overcome what is a structural bias that has been built in. It goes back to the time of the Cold War. It goes back to the time of the creation of the so-called non-aligned movement.
But how exactly do you do that?
How do you do it?
Yeah.
Well, you need help with the United States. One of the things the United States needs to do, and I do think Nikki Haley is doing this as the U.S. ambassador, it can't just be an occasional speech. Right. It has to be calling out the built-in bias. I mean, the kind of Alice in Wonderland quality of having human rights abusers sit on the Human Rights Council is something that you have to call out.
Yeah.
When you realize that close to 70% of all the resolutions in the Human Rights Council in its first 10 years were focused on Israel,
Right.
there's a level of absurdity there that, again, needs to be highlighted. Not occasionally, but as a systematic policy of the United States. Make it an effort on our part to put a spotlight on what's wrong. The more you do that, the more others have to face up to it. When you don't do it, everybody can ignore it and treat it the way too often it has been treated.
Stronger together, you mean. All right. 20 years of sanctions and diplomacy with North Korea have not contained its nuclear program. Is there any option, short of war, of course, that can address this threat? I mean, where is the red line in which America must act?
Well, the red line in America is not always the best terminology to use. You know, the interesting thing about, I'll just say this for, I think, because conceptually it's worth noting this. When you establish a red line, there's potentially two problems with it. The first problem is everything up to the red line becomes acceptable.
Yeah.
We should be very careful about that. Secondly, when you establish a red line, you actually have to act because it's taken as a commitment. I do think there needs to be an unmistakable understanding that the Chinese, for example, must have, and I think the Russians as well. They must have that the United States is not going to live with a North Korea that can put a nuclear weapon on top of an ICBM. Now, if the Chinese are reluctant to put the kind of pressure on North Korea that only they can, because they basically provide almost all of its food and almost all of its fuel. They create the connections to the international financial system. They have been reluctant to put the kind of pressure on it that we think is required because they fear to do that would collapse the regime, and then they might have 23 million refugees coming across their border. Our challenge is to say, okay, look, you don't want the regime to collapse, you can't live with that. But we can't live with North Korea having a nuclear-tipped ICBM. Now, between your position and our position, we need to be able to find an outcome, an acceptable outcome. You know, what I wouldn't do is give up the idea of denuclearization as a long-term aspiration because of the implications it has for the rest of the world. What I would do, however, is at least with the Chinese say, okay, we're not going to achieve that in the near term, but what we have to achieve is this is a country that cannot have the following. It has to stop testing ballistic missiles so that it won't acquire an ICBM. It has to stop testing warheads so it can't perfect that and put them on ballistic missiles. And it cannot be in a position where it transfers that capability, not just the knowledge, that capability to the Iranians and others. I mean, after all, North Korea was building a nuclear reactor in Syria, which, according to published reports, was taken care of by Israel.
Would you agree that the way America will deal with North Korea is a test case for Iran?
Let's begin by coincidence. When I served in Washington, D.C., this wonderful place, 98 to 2002, it began with the Clinton administration. People really forgot that we're talking about 4 consecutive administrations. The Clinton administration, the Bush administration, the Obama administration, and now it's in Trump's hands. Basically, a colossal failure of diplomacy and engagement. The North Koreans, the father Kim Jong-il, and then the son Kim Jong-un, real meshuggahs, by the way. Part of Israel being, at the UN is that we talk to everyone. By the way, under the radar screen, we talk to everyone, I think except for the Iranian ambassador, or the Syrian ambassador, Bashar Jafri, who has this amazing quality, Dennis, of being able to stand and lie for 20 consecutive minutes. I think when he snores, he lies. But we even talked to this Meshuggah from North Korea, the ambassador, and believe me, that's a hell of a Meshuggah. But the point here is, what do we learn? We learn that the minute you engage, in parentheses, and there's nothing else except for engagement or negotiation, and the other side understands that it can breach every red line that is being put before him, at the end of the day, if another thing, meaning all options are on the table, which is a deterrence that creates a different line of thought on the other side, change would probably not be possible. So today, what we see is at least an option of saying all options are on the table. Why? Because all the neighborhood is really watching. And the Iranians are watching. The Iranians are amazing negotiators. They're not just carpet makers, they're carpet weavers. They take every red line, they divide it into 5 pink lines, and they pass every pink line until before you say Jack Robinson, they're way beyond the red line.
That's why they're called, the smiling nation.
Smiling, doing it. I mean, the real threat in the last negotiations on the Iranian deal in Tehran is that they will die from laughing. So in the sense, what we have here is the whole world looking. Deterrence has to be that the other side would understand that there are precautions. What does it mean? It means on the North Korean case to really get the attention of the Chinese, first and foremost. Hey, China, if you don't do something, things might happen in this area, okay? Believe me, the Chinese are now engaged. So from my point of view, North Korea is a test case for Iran. If North Korea can get away with it, oh boy, we have a different ballgame.
I just want to add, as someone who has been a long-time negotiator and mediator, I will tell you that diplomacy almost never works unless it has a coercive element to it. Diplomacy disconnected from coercion means it's disconnected from leverage. Without leverage, you get nothing done. The North Koreans have to be persuaded that there's a price that they don't want to pay that is going to happen unless, in fact, there's an adjustment in behavior. Now, clearly, they have their own strategy. They believe, Kim Jong-un believes that if he has a nuclear-tipped ICBM, suddenly he has the leverage. He's in a position where basically he requires us to do something, and it also gives him a kind of blackmail capability against the South. We really can't afford to get to that point.
Need leverage. All right. So we talked about Iran. Israel is working closer with many of its Arab neighbors. Of course, we can't really talk about it or publish it, but do you think that these relationships will continue to develop in the coming years?
Well, we have something which is very unique with the pragmatic, I never use the word moderate Arab world, and Dennis, who's experienced in those negotiations, we have for the first time the Saudis, the Gulfis, suddenly engaging with us. We have coinciding interests, not because they give a toss about the Palestinians, because they feel that the rope is tightening around their necks because of the Iranian issue. And they're willing to do stuff now that they were not willing to do many years back. The Saudis always remind me of those 2 elderly gentlemen in the Muppet Show, Waldorf and Stadler, sitting on the balcony and shouting, "It's a lousy show." Now they're willing to do some stuff. This is a window of opportunity. At the United Nations, what you see is amazing because the volcano that happens in the Middle East, the eruptions, the changing of coalitions, you see that at the United Nations very clearly. It's changing coalitions. The Saudi ambassador stands on stage, points towards the Iranian ambassador and says, "You tried to assassinate my ambassador, Adel Jubeir," in brackets, now the Saudi foreign minister, in a wonderful restaurant that Dennis and I love, Cafe Milano in Georgetown. And the Iranian ambassador goes after the Saudi goes after the Syrian. And the Kuwaiti ambassador, I didn't even know had vocal cords, suddenly wants to say something and moves the sign Kuwait from horizontal to vertical, saying, "Not only do I vote against Syria, but I co-sponsor a resolution against Syria." And I sit there and I say, continue, gentlemen, continue. In essence, this is a window of opportunity. We have to utilize it because this is the real chance to get the Arab world to help the Palestinians do the heavy lifting that they cannot do by themselves. So the regional issue should be, and we should really try and move that as strong as we can.
But it is very fragile.
Absolutely.
Let me give an explanation of kind of the roots of this that goes a little bit beyond what Ron was saying. In many ways, this was ironically the result of the Obama administration. I say the result, not the design. The result because many of the Arab leaders, especially the Sunni Arab leaders, saw an Obama administration that was withdrawing from the region. There was the pivot to Asia. There was, you know, the impulse to withdraw, given how much our involvement in wars in the region had cost. The perception was the United States could no longer be counted on to play the security role that it always had before. And suddenly, the Saudis and others began to look around and say, well, who's going to play that role? Well, it's not going to be the Russians because basically they were building or abetting, actually, the Iranian threat. It wasn't going to be the Chinese because that's not what the Chinese do. They couldn't count on the U.S., couldn't count on the Europeans, so who do they see? They looked at Israel and they said, well, who else in this region sees the threats the way we do? It's Israel. Who else in the region actually has a capability? Actually, not only has the capability, but has the means and the will to do something. And it's not going anyplace. So it created a convergence of strategic interest. Now, we also have to see what I'd say is the opportunity, but also the limitations. The opportunity here is that there is a potential to take what is a convergence of strategic interest and try to transform it into something more than it is now. Right now, it's below the radar screen. And it will not rise above it unless the Palestinian issue is also dealt with. The Palestinians, as Ron said, really are not in a position to do something on their own. They need an Arab cover. But I would say so does Israel. You know, within the body politic within Israel, the idea of making concessions to the Palestinians is an idea that has someone characterized as a friar, and nobody wants to be a sucker. So the idea is if you're going to make a concession toward the Palestinians, you get something from the Arabs. But again, to complete the circle, for the Arabs to play that role, they need two things. One, they need to see that the U.S. is going to address the threats that most concern them. And right now, the rhetoric of the administration towards Iran is very strong. The actual actions towards Iran at this point are not. So you see what is a tone that is quite different from the last administration. But if you look at Syria today, the U.S. looks like it's prepared basically to do very little except focus on ISIS, while Iran is acting now to fill the vacuum that we're creating by defeating ISIS. So there needs to be more coherence from that standpoint for the Arabs, and they will also need to show that they are able to produce something from Israel for the Palestinians. They will not do this unless they can also show what they're delivering for the Palestinians.
Gentlemen, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage